All right, Rob, so let's talk about the fuel for ideas in a business. So we've all got loads and loads of ideas. We come up with them every day, don't we? And usually they just drift off into the ether, don't they? You have loads of conversations about it, but they never really come to any form of fruition. And I think partly that's because there's no real process in place to take those ideas into something, into a project. But partly those ideas are often quite random and come from like individual bias. So how do you get good productive ideas in a business? Like, what is the good fuel for ideas?
Well, we think about the fuel as two things really. One's stimulus and one's insight. So stimulus is really the technical stuff. So what's possible, generally the preserve of your technical team, so R&D, whoever's looking after the technical aspects of your business. Then the other aspect of this is insight, which is understanding the customer, the consumer, or the market, the more commercial aspects of it, which probably sit with your sales or marketing function. And the best ideas would combine both of those.
So let's talk about each one of those then. So stimulus, what do we think, how would we explain stimulus?
Like for me, stimulus is the kind of what's possible. So whatever sector you work in, let's take health, because that's obviously a good one for us to talk about. But you know, health is kind of like understanding about illnesses, medicines, how you fix it, digital health, and you know, fundamentally, how does the body work? How do drugs work? How does medicine work? That would be the stimulus, the technical side of it. On the other hand, the insight would be more the touchy-feely, understanding the patient, what do they want, what kind of outcomes are they after, you know, the insight around that rather than just what I'm telling you to take as a doctor or what to do to fix your illness.
So when we're thinking about stimulus and insights to fuel ideas, we're essentially saying the stimulus is the technical knowledge, the data, the official stuff that's out there that you and your competitors can probably access. You know, it's the stuff that's how can we do this, what's available, we know we can do this. It's that technical knowledge. And we're saying the insight is actually that more almost empathetic side of it, where you're kind of close to the consumer, you're understanding their pain points, you're understanding the effects that it has on their daily lives, and you're trying to essentially solve that problem. That's insight into the customer's life, and using the stimulus, the technical capacity to solve that problem. And so you would say stimulus is the fuel and insight is the spark, if we was to do it as in a fire sort of sense. So if you was a smaller business, obviously larger corporations in terms of technical data and stuff, they can access lots of things on papers and all that kind of stuff. And from an insight point of view, they can do endless amounts of market research, probably don't do it particularly well, but they can get whatever data they want. If you was a smaller business, how do you get that real world insight from the end user?
That's an interesting challenge. I mean, we tend to think that big companies are great at doing this because they have the resources, but generally speaking, they tend to all go to the same places for their stimulus and their insight. They all read the same journals, they go to the same trade shows, they watch the same TED Talks, blah, 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 and they do market research in a kind of a similar way. And I think that constrains the thinking of a sector because all of the big players are tending to collect stimulus and insight in the same way. And what you really need to do is to get beyond those obvious sources. And what we tend to see in large sector or large organisations is they're all doing the same thing. They're all copying one another. And they are literally copying each other as well. But part of that is because they're all going to the same place for their stimulus and insight. So paradoxically, a small organisation probably doesn't have the resources to do large market research studies and go to the classic market research place. But so they have to think of another way of connecting with their customer or consumer. And that can actually lead to novelty because they're kind of going beyond the obvious sources. And we've said this before, like, you know, if you want to know about your sector, if you sell washing powder, you know, you can go and speak to, you know, scientists about surfactants and cleaning products, etc., etc. But you can equally go and stand in Tesco and watch people buying washing powder and literally ask them what do they think about the products. You know, to me, that's a much smarter way of gathering insight.
Do you know the way I always think about it? Do you know when you just have random conversations with a member of your family or something? Because the public, the consumer, always come up with ideas, don't they? Because it's they're experiencing it in their daily life. So, you know, I don't know, your wife or your brother or somebody will say something like, I don't know why they don't just do this. It would make life a lot easier. It's those like little conversations. That's the insight, isn't it? Which you don't get in really market research or any kind of data reports. You get that from the real world perspective of the person using the product. I would argue probably so many larger corporations are actually far more detached from the end user of their products. Because as you said, they're developing them based on science and data and collected forms of feedback or whatever, but it's not really insight. It's like numbers on a page.
Yep.
So it doesn't really reflect the day-to-day pain points.
No. And also, like, again, to use a safe analogy that I understand, but like if you think about headache, if you're GlaxoSmithKline and you think about headache, you can afford to go to Oxford University and hire the smartest academic in this country to talk about headache. But actually, circle all your competitors and they're probably already talking to that person. If you really want to understand headache, go and speak to a primary school teacher who has to stand up in front of 30 kids every day for 8 hours a day and has got loads of stuff to do outside of their life, and how do they deal with headache? And that's a much closer to the action, closer to the pain point of understanding what headache is, that, how do they feel when they've got a headache? How do they deal with it? To me, that's much smarter than going to speak to the experts that are accessible really easily for everybody.
Yeah, because if you make headache tablets, then the data would tell you this formulation we've put together, this does cure headache pain. It does it in this amount of time that we claim it does it in, or whatever. Or, this toothpaste does make your teeth whiter, or whatever, whatever that is that you're claiming. So it's not that information is wrong. It might not be totally aligned with the experience of the person using. So maybe it does technically do that, but maybe the format in which they have to take that, or the time in which they have to take that, doesn't align with their working lives. I saw a product with, it's like teeth whitening products, but they say you have to put it in your gum shield or whatever, and you have to sit there for 4 hours and and do it in the afternoon or something like that, and you're like, okay, well, it's not really going to work because I've got to work. So it's those kind of real world examples, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So stimulus is needed. That's basically the technical knowledge, what's available, what's possible, what's the data out there. You can see that, most of your competitors can see that, and that's really good stuff to have, because it's staying ahead of what's going on. You're making sure that you're keeping up with what's going on technologically, and it might also be keeping up with what's going on from a legislation point of view, or from cultural points of view, or whatever, ingredients, raw materials, whatever, that sort of stuff, costings. But the insight is really about that direct experience with the end user, the person who's going to be, who are you making it for, and are you solving their problem? And are you solving it in an effective way? Are you staying close? And are you able to adapt as their lives change to make sure that your product or service, whatever it is you offer, is adapting with them? So those are the two kind of ingredients. Underpinning all that, if you're an organization, how do you make sure you keep hold of this stuff? How do you ensure you're staying ahead of stimulus, and how do you ensure you're keeping up with the insight?
This is a massive problem, because obviously, as you already said earlier, there's no shortage of ideas. And behind all of those ideas, there are tons and tons of pieces of pieces of insight. It's really hard to stay on top of that, especially in an organisation when people move around a lot. So you have to have a way of managing that, fundamentally, and that's not easy. I think AI can be a tool to do this moving forward. If you had a way of using AI to basically create a large language model that understands all the stuff you've got, you can ask it questions and get that, and that would be pretty cool, a body of corporate memory that would be very, very valuable to someone.
The fact is this: if you work in a business, most stuff just gets lost in the ether, doesn't it? You'll send an email to someone, hey, I've been thinking about doing this, Dave, or whatever, and say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, well, let's talk about it over coffee or whatever, and maybe you'll get some momentum on it, but then it kind of gets lost. Or somebody leaves the company, or it kind of gets put aside because there's something more pressing to deal with or whatever. And then, if you do revisit it, if you're lucky enough to do that in a couple of weeks or a few months or something, you're essentially searching your email box. What was that email I sent to? So there's just no process. There's no real foundation in place.
And like the temporal issue of this is really important, because every idea has its time. Well, not necessarily every idea, but most ideas have their time, and the time at which you present an idea may not be the right time for the business. So that there needs to be a mechanism of knowing what was said 5, 10, 15 or 3 weeks ago. There has to be a way of going back to that to see if the problems you're solving now, those ideas that were suggested a while back, are they okay to use now? And I think that's a massive challenge for an organisation. If people hang around in roles for a long time and they have expertise and they can remember, then great. But you're relying on their memory, you're relying on them to be around again. And you can almost guarantee that companies are reinventing the wheel, on a very, very frequent basis, which is kind of depressing and obviously a massive waste of resources.
I always think, if I'm thinking of like a real life example, when you have like a spare screw or something left over from something like that, or a spare bolt or whatever, like
just
a
throw
thing.
It away.
There's that thing where you go, I'll keep hold of that. It's like that old adage. It's a bit of a dad thing, isn't it? But you I'll keep hold of that because that'll come in handy. I need a grip for that or whatever. And then, 3 years down the line, you kind of have that thing. So you didn't need that tool or whatever it was at that particular time, or that Allen key or something. But actually later on, that came in really handy for the thing that you was doing, which is a real lame example. But I always think of ideas in that same kind of context. They're so passive. Well, no, yeah, it's not right for us right now, or it's not very good, or it doesn't really fit what we're trying to do. So, gone, and off it goes into the ether. We never see it again. Whereas if you had like a storage, a tool drawer, if you like, a vault, whatever you want to call it, but something to put that idea in, tag it or attach it to a series of parameters. So later down the line, when it says, how do we find a thing that deals with that problem we're trying to deal with? Let's look in the tool chest. And pull it up. What have we got in the bank? And that's one side. And then if you're aligning that with the insight that you constantly should be collecting, because you should always be speaking to your customers, you should always be in line with what they're thinking, then you should have an endless armory.
So, like for me, like stimulus and insight is the day-to-day activity of innovation, and everyone in your organisation should be going out and collecting stimulus and insight. It's kind of like a game, a treasure hunt, if you like, where you spend your time noticing things, not just when you're at work, when you're watching TV, if you watch film, when you're traveling, when you're talking to people. All of this stuff is diffusing into you, and on their own, those little pieces are just pieces of a jigsaw that don't necessarily make sense. But when you have an idea, it's not just, sometimes I suppose it could be a eureka moment. You just have a flash of inspiration and you have a brand new idea. But usually it's a series of assembling bits and pieces, and those bits and pieces are what you would call stimulus and insight, and then you pull them together and it becomes an idea. I certainly know in my own mind, and maybe this is just me, but most of the ideas or innovations that I've been responsible for, very few, you can almost like backtrack where all of that information came from. And what we're doing on Flex Health, and I don't really want to make this a plug for Flex Health, I can trace back exactly how I met Martin, who was the inventor of the algorithms in Flex, and all of the steps that led to that. And it takes a long time. I mean, it happens over years in many cases, but eventually it all comes together and tips over into a product or an idea.
So as an example then, so let's just take that Flex Health. Like, in a nutshell, what is that product, and then how would you trace back the stimulus and insight over that?
Well, this is a really interesting story. Well, I find it interesting. Let's see if
we might cut it out of the podcast later. We'll see how long it goes for.
No, well, in my last job, we were interested in the benefit of physical activity as an area of innovation for us as an organisation. I actually went to Sheffield Hallam University, went to see a presentation, and this GP from Sheffield was presenting. He's called Ollie Hart. And he was talking about the benefits of physical activity and how he was doing a programme in Sheffield to look at physical activity. And it made me think, actually, that's really interesting. We started to pull some of this stuff together about how we might participate in that. I told somebody else that I knew who was in Nottingham, who was an innovation consultant, and he knew Martin. And he said, I've met this guy called Martin, you should speak to Martin. So I spoke to Martin, and that resulted in us looking at what he was doing to fit that old corporate problem. Then I ended up leaving, and then we ended up developing that product. But it's like step back. If I hadn't gone to Sheffield Hallam that day, we probably would have never been interested in physical activity. I would never have told my friend in Nottingham that we were, and I wouldn't have met Martin. So it's really interesting how these sort of things sort of circle around. And actually, right today, we're on an accelerator at Sheffield University. And I'm actually back in the labs where I was there back in 2013 talking about Flex. So it's just a really weird journey. It
is always a chain of events, isn't it? Yeah, I think you're right. And I think you're also right about ideas. I think when people hear us talk about innovation, particularly from a business perspective, it always sounds, very kind of fluffy, and like they imagine big eureka moments, and they're like, look, I'm not focused on that. I'm focused on just like driving my business and achieving the bottom line and doing what we do, which is fine. It's that is what business is. It's the function of business. But innovation underpins all of that, because you've got to keep evolving the business. If you're not evolving it, then it's not going to add value. Eventually, it's going to run out of ideas, if you like, because something else has come along and circumvented that. So you do always have to be collecting ideas, and you always have to be seeing whether those ideas add any real value. And maybe at that point, they don't add any real value. Maybe it's just a moment that passes. But if you're not storing that or recording that in some format, how are you ever going to draw on that Because every one of those ideas actually is a piece of insight in itself, isn't it? As you say, because it's from personal experience, professional experience, something you've seen, something you've heard. So really that collection of stimulus and that collection of insight should continuously evolve. It should be part of the culture of the business.
But like for me, cognitively, if you're involved in collecting stimulus and insight as part of your profession and what you do, that stuff is forming neural synapses in your brain and basically creating memories. And eventually all of those things light up and literally light up and produce an idea. And I think that's generally pretty cool. Yeah. And what I think is really interesting, if you want to have novel, more innovative ideas, is the more diverse those inputs are, the better. And we talked about music before, and it's kind of like developing a record collection, isn't it? If I look about record collection at the age of 54, there's some embarrassing stuff in there. There's also lots of cool stuff, obviously. Yeah. But it's fairly diverse because I've been on a journey, and that's led to me to have a fairly eclectic collection of records now. Yeah. But the point I'm trying to make is that the more of those side branches you take, even if you don't like that music now, it's added to your sort of knowledge and appreciation of that topic. And it's the same if you work in any other sector. You know, all of those pieces of that puzzle you pull together, the more eclectic those memories and that knowledge you assimilate, the more novel your innovation is going to be. So it's really important to go firstly beyond the obvious sources of insight and stimulus for your sector, but also go fishing in other ponds, go to other sectors. You know, I'm a scientist, works in healthcare. I think it would be amazing to look at what artists do as an adjunct to what happens in science. And there are lots of science art projects and collaborations, and I think that's a really interesting way to sort of push the boundary.
And that's working the other way around as well, isn't it? Because people that are working in the arts world are using science to essentially underpin their art projects to make it do something else. You know, so these collaborations, these fusions, if you like, are happening. And again, that's all from just different insights, different experiences, different journeys you've been on, different people you've met. It's just so important, and I guess really the purpose of this is to say that firstly, all good organizations should have some form of innovation process in place so that when there is an idea and they're thinking, how are we going to do this, there's actually a tangible process of where that goes. So somebody comes up with the idea, then what? Where does it go? Who deals with it? How do you test it? How do you build it? What, you know, have you got this written down on a map? You know, what is it that you do? At the start of that innovation process is stimulus and insight. What is capable? Stimulus, what's possible? What can we do? What's out there? What's available to us? And insight, what does the end user want? Yep. What are our customers' needs? What are the problems that we need to solve? Yep. And I think, as you said, that it's rarely like a eureka moment. Innovation is not all about flying rockets to Mars and like really extreme things that people think of. Innovation is about just evolving just a little bit more, solving the problem, and being capable to be able to adapt what it is that you're doing to address whatever that problem is.
Yeah, exactly. The only thing we haven't said that's important to mention at this point is that ideas should be insight-led, not stimulus-led. Yeah. So in other words, you should be developing innovation that meets a problem that you've identified through insight, as opposed to pushing a technology that you can do just because you can do it. Yeah. I think there are some good examples of innovation that is stimulus-led, where we've created products that become successful because we've created a cool thing that people happen to like. Yeah. But generally speaking, you should be led by your insights.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, and we won't delve too much into it because it's a whole other podcast, but obviously there's so much talk around technology at the moment. Every man and their dog is talking about AI and all that kind of stuff. And it's not that it's not interesting, and the possibilities are wonderful. I really believe that there's lots of things that these new technologies will be able to do. But if you're just adopting the technology for the sake of adopting it, and we talk about this a lot, don't make everything digital for the sake of being digital, because it just makes no sense. If you're just adopting the technology and saying, well, this is kind of cool, let's use this, then you have to ask yourself, why? What is the problem you're solving? Yep. If there's something driven from insight, so from the end user, or it might not be the end user also might be internal, so this could be a business process thing or something, it might not necessarily be a customer, or it could be a sector-led thing, but fundamentally, is there a problem that you're addressing, making better, improving, whatever? If it involves adopting some form of technology to inform that, great. That's where your stimulus comes from. The stimulus says, look, there's this thing out here that we can use. But you should only be looking at that if the insight says, this is a problem we need to deal with. So as you say, insight-led.
Exactly.
Yeah. So stimulus and insight, make it part of your company process.
Make it what you do every day.
Yeah.
Be curious.
Awesome. Thanks, Rob. See you next time.
Bye. Cheers.